Welcome to Doc NYC's Spring Showcase. I'm the festival's artistic director, Tom Powers. I'm pleased to host this conversation about Once Upon a Time in Queens with director Nick Davis. I'd like to thank ESPN Films for helping make this happen. Nick, thanks for being here. I wanted to start by asking you, what was your relationship with baseball in 1986?
Well, thank you for having me. My relationship with baseball in 1986 is I was a diehard Mets fan who was living through the year I had been dreaming of and hoping and praying for my entire life. So it was wonderful as it was happening, and it was also quite obviously happening, and there was a lot of pressure and tension, like, would it really happen? But the progression of that team through the years, as we detail in the film, was kind of amazing as step by step they got closer and closer to the promised land.
And so was this a project that you brought to ESPN, or did someone bring it to you and it was a happy meeting because of your own fandom?
No, I brought it to them. My previous film had been with Major League Baseball about Ted Williams, and so I had developed a relationship with Major League Baseball. But the truth is, the 1986 Mets were like the white whale that was out there for years, and I would read about documentaries. I remember in 2010 or 2011, there was something about it, and I was furious at myself for not having been the one to make it happen. And so when I started the Ted Williams film in 2015, I asked Major League Baseball, what happened to that 86 Mets project? And, for a variety of reasons, it never happened. And I said, well, can we do it? And they said, well, let's get through this first. So we got through the Ted Williams thing, and then, Major League Baseball and I partnered and went to the Mets, created a pitch, and the rest. It was a dream from start to finish. I mean, I could not be happier with the fact that it happened, and that I was lucky enough to be the one to do it.
So you have a lot of interviews of both people inside the Mets organization, fans. Was everyone happy to talk, or did some people take some persuading?
Some people took some persuading, I think, because their reputation is so kind of tarnished, and because there was so much, the allegations and then proof of bad behavior. I think some of them felt like, oh gosh, do we have to do this again? But when I would talk to them, I would say, no, we're not just doing that. We're doing the whole story. And you guys were also, in addition to being, whatever you were off the field, you were a tremendously talented and entertaining group of baseball players. And I want to tell the full story. And once they got that, they were all, to a man on board. So it was pretty great.
So, I mean, the story does encompass a lot of toxic behavior, including addiction and domestic abuse, and which your film gets into in varying degrees. Can you talk about how you tried to balance some of those more negative things while also celebrating the team's accomplishments?
Yeah, I think that the goal was tell the full story, and it's sort of a cliche and not a very helpful thing to say, but the fact is it was a different time, and people had very, very different attitudes about a lot of the things that team was doing then, and they weren't the only ones doing it. So we wanted to put everything in context, at a time and place when, cocaine was just a party drug and everybody was seemingly doing it. It wasn't seen as quite the scourge to some people. I mean, some people did feel like, hey, and I want nothing to do with these guys or that thing. But it was part of the fabric, certainly of New York City in the mid 80s. And so I wanted to just make sure that we weren't just, wagging our finger at them, but putting it in context and giving people a sense of, okay, yeah, they did some really awful things, but a lot of people were doing a lot of pretty awful things.
Well, I mean, it really stands out to me in the film how you are trying to bring a wider context of the 1980s. And I'd love to hear more about, how that evolved in your process, and, the choices that you made to, for instance, you have Kurt Anderson and others talking about, the rise of the financial industry in the 1980s and how much monies became more and more important to people. How did you kind of find your ways about what you were going to focus on?
Well, I knew that I didn't really want to make this a baseball film. I wanted to make a film about New York City in the 1980s and use the Mets as the lens through which to examine all these other things. And one of the first people I reached out to was Kurt Anderson, because in the summer of 1986, he was putting together Spy Magazine, which had its first issue come out that fall, right as the Mets were about to go into the playoffs and World Series. And he said, I don't know anything about baseball. I said, that's fine. And we did an interview with him, and everything he said about New York City in the 80s applied to the Mets. He honestly he doesn't know a basket from a home run. And I don't mean that only facetiously, but his commentary, although we didn't use that much of it, did sort of provide us, and others as well, it gave us a sort of that thing I was talking about before, which is a context. I'd never known and have never seen a sports team that so captured a time and place the way the 86 Mets did. I mean, you think of great teams, but sometimes it's just like, well, that team played in Boston at that time, but not they became Boston. And the 86 Mets just were fused with the city in a really strange and wonderful way. So, things like music and archival footage, we were fortunate enough, and I'm tip of the hat to ESPN who's here, they gave us a healthy music budget. So we wanted to be able to really take you back into that world and use things like, the Tears for Fears anthem, Everybody Wants to Rule the World, and show, okay, that's not just the Mets dominating, that's Reagan telling us we have to dominate, that's people doing drugs, that's America and, New York City celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty. All those things were sort of all happening at once. And it was really important that we recreate it for the viewer who didn't live through it.
I want to ask you about the archival footage, even just thinking about the way you tell the story of Game 6. There's multiple angles on some key plays. You've got footage from inside the locker rooms. As people are making decisions at the last minute about where to put the trophy and whether there's going to be a celebration at the end of Game 6 or if it's going to go on to Game 7. Can you talk about how what it was like unearthing all that footage? I mean, does that footage exist in a network that's well categorized, or does it take more digging?
Well, a lot of that took a lot of digging, and kudos to our archival producers and everybody who worked on the film, because we had to go digging for a lot of it. Major League Baseball had in 1986 decided to give the Mets a documentary film crew and document their year, and they'd never done this before. And I don't think they've done it since. But so they didn't go to every game, but there was a more behind the scenes footage from that year and that team than almost any other team at that time. And some of it had been used in a to Met fans well-known year-end video that everybody got that Christmas for a year-end video, but most of it had not. So, things like the cameraman just, following Mookie Wilson up the line. And then when the ball goes through Buckner's legs, then the cameraman rushes the field, which nowadays you see that live. But no one had ever seen that shot before. And then the guy stayed on the field with Mookie and then followed Mookie down into the dugout and then down the dugout steps into the clubhouse. And that, to me, that, tracking shot, when we saw that for the first time, no one had ever seen it. It was like, this is like that scene in Goodfellas. I mean, it's the Copacabana shot, only it's Mookie Wilson having just done this miraculous thing or been part of a miraculous thing. I guess hitting a ground ball to first is not actually doing something that miraculous. But, so there were these moments of just unbelievable joy when you saw stuff that people hadn't seen before. You referenced the NBC footage or the footage of NBC setting up in the Red Sox clubhouse during Game 6 when it looks like the Red Sox are about to win the World Series and break their, decades-long curse. And again, some of that had been seen, but the full extent of it and people taping up, plastic sheeting so that the champagne doesn't get in the locker rooms, in the lockers, it was a thrill to find it. And the other thing we did is for the start of episode 4, we put the word out to Met fans and Red Sox fans or anybody who might have remembered where they were during that famous Game 6 and said to people, like, send in your stories because we want to hear them. And so that was really a fun way to sort of get people involved and also tell the story of this moment. There are these moments where everybody remembers where they were. Usually they're tragic. This one, even if you're a Red Sox fan, it's not tragic. It's just too bad. It's a sporting event. You can't take it too seriously. But this one was a moment where people, Met fans certainly remembered in a kind of glorious way this moment of joy and triumph.
I want to, as someone who has made films on sports, you mentioned your film on Ted Williams, made a film about Tour de France. Now this 4-hour project. I'm curious to hear more about what draws you into sports as a focal point for your filmmaking. You've made films about other things, written books, but when you're preoccupied with sports, what is it that excites you?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, it's all about characters. First of all, I think that, sports display or reveal character in a really interesting way. And this particular team was full of such interesting characters regardless. I think if they were just working on in a coal mine, that's a really interesting group of people. Darryl Strawberry, Dwight Gooden, Keith Hernandez, Gary Carter, Lenny Dykstra, Bobby Ojeda. These are really interesting, weird, distinctive, charismatic people. And so it's fun to just get to know those people. The other thing that I have found, and I've been surprised by it because I don't consider myself like a sports filmmaker, but I do notice that when I'm working on these films, it puts you in a good mood. The people who are being interviewed are happy to talk about this sporting event, and it isn't all that serious, and it isn't a political thing where people are arguing, and so you find that the whole day of you're working on this, you're just smiling and engaged in a very upbeat, positive way, even if the guys are doing terrible things off the field. And I feel like for myself, and this is just for me, I've really enjoyed that, especially given the world these days. It's been a real joy and a balm for me to be working on things where everybody seems to be bright-eyed and happy as they tell these stories, and that's really fun, and it's a gift. And I'm very, again, I'm so grateful I got to do this one, and I'm eager to do more films about where the people are excited about what they're talking about in a buoyant way. I think we need it.
Yeah. I have my own sports fanaticisms, and I grew up in metropolitan Detroit, and so I have my own allegiances to those teams, for better or worse. In recent years, mostly worse. But I sometimes question, what's the meaning of being a fan and the kind of time it preoccupies in my life, and sometimes I worry is taking away from things that are arguably more important to spend time on, or I question the tribalistic rivalries that sports engenders, pitting one set of fans against another, and some of the obnoxious behavior that can come out of that. And And I wonder what your own, if you have similar questions about how much
Totally.
time
Yeah.
we give up to sports.
Yes, and in fact, very early on in my fandom, even before '86, I was 21 in 1986. But fairly early on, I think there had just been one, especially the Mets were so bad for so many years. There were one too many nights of turning off the TV at, 11, and I think, well, that was a waste of a night. And I can't devote more time to these guys. They don't care about me, and I'm giving them 3.5 hours a night. It's too much. And I did kind of make a decision. I'm going to live my life. I'm going to pay attention to them and care about them, but I'm not going to give them nearly as much time unless I go to the games. And so actually, and also, frankly, I get too nervous. So I've kind of stopped watching live unless something is happening that I really need to watch. And you get into the playoffs and World Series, I don't watch the games. And so I'm as big a fan as I've ever been. I don't know if this is helpful, in terms of a filmmaking answer, but I certainly do feel like I don't want to give them nearly as much of my time as I used to, and so I don't. And it's not, and frankly, it's not life and death. I mean, the other day was the anniversary of the death of bin Laden, and so they beamed out, on Twitter and stuff, these clips of how fans in Philadelphia reacted to the news sort of leaking out in the middle of a Met Philly game, and the fans all chanting USA, USA. And it was a weird moment to all be celebrating the death of someone. And it was interesting, fascinating moment. But one of the radio announcers said, it does put things in perspective when you realize how angry you were about, the double play that somebody hit into, 3 minutes ago. And now all of a sudden you're reminded of like something serious and real. And sports, they're real. The feelings are real. There are winners and losers, and there's a lot of money, but it's not ultimately that, it doesn't change things other than our feelings and our joy and our rage. It's an outlet for things without being ultimately that important. And I think that's what makes it great.
I wonder if you heard from people who are in the film after they watched it, and particularly those people who have complicated stories in this.
Yeah, you never make the film thinking about that, or at least I don't like, it's sort of irrelevant ultimately to whether or not you've done a good job. But in fact, I got some wonderful emails and phone calls from some of the players. And, as a filmmaker, I was thrilled. As a lifelong Met fan, when all of a sudden Darryl Strawberry is calling me and saying how moved he was, it was like, come on. I mean, this is, 21-year-old me was overjoyed, but I can't say that, 50 whatever me was any less overjoyed. So it was pretty great. And Keith Hernandez was they were all extremely kind, and they felt we'd done it right, and that was meaningful.
That's fantastic. I want to ask about your larger career. Your father, Peter Davis, is a documentary filmmaker, had a career at CBS, won an Academy Award for Hearts and Minds, made many other projects. I wonder what you took away for your own career growing up with him.
Well, it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, he and I worked on a film together many years ago on John Kennedy, and so getting to actually work with him was the most instructive. I mean, it's not like he ever sat me down and told me things, but I feel like getting to see him in action, seeing what he did, that I felt worked, what he did that I felt like, I don't care about that as much. So that was a really powerful, informative moment for me. After which I realized, like, okay, this is a great way to live your life. I think, when I was saying before, he's a very serious filmmaker. His films, I mean, I think he also did some things at CBS. He did one show called It's What's Happening Now, Baby, in 1965. So I've always wanted to see that one. But for the most part, he made sort of politically minded films and very serious films. And when I do that, it's great, it's terrific. But I did notice from the first film I actually ever worked on, which was Ken Burns' Baseball. And Ken Burns would say, boy, this is different from people talking about the Battle at Chickamauga. It's so heavy, and it's nice to be in the world where people are just talking about baseball. And so I think that was something I took from thinking about my father as well.
Right. The years he spent making a film about the war in Vietnam, chances are he was not experiencing joy on a daily basis.
No. And actually, I was very alert for that. I mean, I was 7 and 8 and was noticing, first of all, it was terrifying. He was going to Vietnam, so that was scary. And then, there was such a seriousness of purpose. And my brother and I were once up, he shot an interview on a roof in Greenwich Village where we lived. And my brother and I were up playing on the roof at the same time. And we got into the background of a shot, and, he waved at us to duck down or whatever. And it wasn't a big deal to him. I was miserable. I thought, I've ruined this movie about the Vietnam War. I should be, thrown off the roof. I mean, I was so, because it all felt so important. And I took from that, like, it doesn't need to be so important. And frankly, I don't think he acted that way. It was my own internal stuff.
You have another new project, a book about Herman and Joe Mankiewicz. Herman Mankiewicz was your grandfather. Can you say a little bit about this this new biography that you've just published?
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I can. Yeah. So Herman Mankiewicz was my mother's father, and he wrote most famously Citizen Kane, and was a famous Hollywood screenwriter and the subject of the movie Mank by David Fincher, starring Gary Oldman a year or two ago. And the book is about him and his brother Joe Mankiewicz, who made All About Eve, and among many other films was a writer-director. And it's about their relationship and about Hollywood and success in the movie business and what it does to you and what you have to do in order to get it. And they had a very interesting and dynamic, very interesting dynamic. And they were 11 and a half, 12 years apart. Herman was larger than life and wonderful and witty, and everybody loved him. And he was an alcoholic who drank himself into an early grave. And Joe was sort of, ambitious, witty, and smart and brilliant, but wasn't as beloved a figure and wasn't nearly the charisma that Herman was. And it's my contention that All About Eve is in many ways an emotional autobiography on the part of Joe, where Herman becomes Bette Davis, Margot Channing, and Joe is Eve Harrington, the sort of ambitious, cold usurper of that larger figure. So anyway, I explore all these kinds of family stories and their stories in the book. And, it only took me 19 years to write the book.
well, alongside making film projects, I mean, what is that like, kind of shifting your energy from filmmaking that's more collaborative, you're working with material coming in, versus writing that can feel more solitary and is a battle between you and the blank page often?
Yeah, it certainly is, and it's why it took me so long. I think it was really great for me to have it, because so much of filmmaking is spent waiting. You're waiting for an answer from the network, or you're waiting on set. And when you have a writing project that you can always turn to, all right, well, I got an hour and a half here before this Zoom meeting. So, all right, let me dig into the book and do some work. So it was wonderful to just sort of have it to tap into. On the other hand, there were times when you have to go really deep to get into the zone there. And so you needed sometimes to just carve out, like, I need several hours before I can really do the work I need here. But luckily or not, film projects sometimes take a while to get off the ground. So between projects, I always had the book.
So do you have a future sports project in mind?
I do. I do. It's too early to talk about, but ESPN knows about it, and it may, in fact, even be on their network. I'm very excited about that one. And then I've got another one that's sort of more theatrical based, but is also it's happy. You know, it's people talking about something that was kind of wonderful. You know, I have political projects that I'm trying to generate as well, but I really love, I love recreating a moment in time when things just felt magical. So that's what both of the other film projects that I'm pushing along are right now are about.
Thank you for the series, Once Upon a Time in Queens. Thank you for your new book, and thanks for taking time today.
Thank you, Tom. It's such a pleasure and honor to speak to you.
Oh, I appreciate it.